another series of sewing videos. The first one we have is a rag quilt. So this is scraps from two different quilts I made previously. These squares are 6x6s, and obviously they're a lot smaller now because cotton shrinks. This is what a feathered rag quilt looks like after you've washed and dried it. So I'm going to show you how to make this. You can make this as big or as small as you want. It just depends on the squares. All right, see you in a few. To make a rag quilt, you need to have your fabric on top and your fabric on bottom. I personally believe that the fabric on bottom should always be flannel. So for all of my squares, they have gray flannel on the bottom, but then a different flannel on top for this particular rag quilt. For the other quilt I have, it actually has black flannel on the back and then novelty cotton on the top. And the reason for that is because this is actually a recycled quilt from a previous rag quilt I did, whereas the squares for that quilt were 12x12 and all of these are 6x6. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out all of the squares out of the leftover fabric from those quilts, and we'll see how many I've got. So after I did all of that, I have two big piles, which is this gray and blue-gray camo and the light gray with the medium gray on bottom like all the other squares have. After that, I have some woodland ones. Some more woodland ones, because it was a hunting quilt that I'm recycling from. This fabric was chosen for that quilt because of the wife really wanted this fabric. And these are leftovers from a otter quilt that I did at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead, and all of these are going to have X's sewn on them. So, movie magic, each one is going to have an X like this sewn. And then, as soon as all of them are sewn, we're going to play around and see how I'm going to arrange them. This next bit, you're going to want to make sure that your square has all the sides pretty much meeting each other. However, what you want to make sure is that you have wrong sides together. So, right side on this side, right side on this side, wrong sides are touching on the inside. The reason for that is because this is going to not be turned inside out. So when you get started on this, you're going to sew an X. So you want to make sure that you start at approximately the correct angle so that all your feed dogs have to do is feed in a straight line all the way down. So let's go ahead and try it. Remember to hold your strings at the start, because you are not backstitching either. You should approximately end right there. So I'm going to model that a few more times, and then you can go ahead. Remember to clip your ends, and then you can make all of your squares just like that. All done. So I laid out all my squares on the floor, and then I had 80 squares, which is enough for an 8x10. So then I just kind of worked around and made sure that everything was where I wanted it.
now what I'm going to do is label each row as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and pin it like I would to sew it, making sure that the tops are labeled and everything's going in the correct direction. And of course I'm back stitching on that, but I'm going to take a quick picture of this, and this is what my quilt will look like when it's done. Well, sort of. This is at least what it'll look like, somewhat. There's Ranger. As I said, Mama's boy. He was laying on the upper corner of that earlier. So I've pinned an entire column. So I pin by columns instead of by rows, so that I'll sew whatever side is longest first, and then have the least amount of super long ones to sew together. And plus it makes it easier for me to look at it and be like, okay, I know which ones are the tops and the sides and everything else. So when you pin this, you're actually going to pin so that your top side is facing on top, because you want all of the seams on top for a rag quilt, because then you're going to snip them and then fray them and it's going to look amazing. That's also the other reason why the other side is all of this gray material, is so that it looks uniform when you've cut everything and everything's together. So when you sew this, you need to figure out what seams you want to begin with, and then go ahead. See, and I don't want super long seams, but I don't want super short ones either, because otherwise they won't fray. So I'm going to go with this half-inch seam. So you go forward, back, and then forward again. These don't need to be completely accurate, and the reason for that is because you're going to be fraying all the seams anyway. So when you fray the seams, it makes it so that all the corners matching is significantly less of an issue. So this is my seam, and then we're going to we're going to fray this, and it's going to be really cool looking after you fray it and wash it, because then all of this is going to look really, really nice and really, really fun. I prefer rag quilts because they're easier to make, and the fact that you don't, like, I'm not particularly great at matching my corners for quilts, because apparel and things like that is typically what I sew. Rag quilts like this is more of a mix and match and choose your own adventure game versus other quilts that I've made. And this one's also a scrap. This will make a good, like, toss blanket, so I'm going to continue sewing all of these seams, and I'm going to perform movie magic by getting them done off camera and coming back, and showing you what I've done. For the most part, don't worry too much about whether or not everything matches up, because again, it's not going to be something that's going to be super obvious at this stage, because you're going to be clipping your corners anyway. Alright, so I will see you in a few. I've already performed some moving magic. I have sewn most of this quilt, so we're just going to sew the last column on, and I'll show you a few techniques while we do. So of course, I am still at that half-inch mark. I'm going to go forward, I'm going to go back, so that the seam holds still. Okay, so one thing you're going to notice is that there is a lot of fabric right here on either side. So what I'm doing is I'm making sure that the top row goes up, the bottom one goes down, so it isn't going over this much fabric, but instead of that much fabric at each seam. And I will tell you that it is incredibly hard to sew a quilt with a tripod in your viewing space. Especially because this is the last part of this quilt. Almost there. I am now not having to fight the bulk of this fabric of this quilt. So make sure your corners at the very bottom match. When you get toward the end, your seams for the most part should have already lined up. Forward, back, forward, and cut. So, this is what my quilt looks like. When I am on this next part, you're going to be feathering all of these seams, and that's to take a pair of scissors and this seam right, all the seams, and just cut. Like you're making feathers. And then when you wash it, it'll fray and look absolutely stunning when you're done. So I'm going to go ahead and do that because that's several hours worth of work right there just to do that step. So I'm going to pop on a show, get a nice pair of scissors. You can use scissors like that or scissors like this because it will retract back into your hand each time. And get her done. I just realized I skipped a step. Don't forget at the edges of your quilt to do that same 1/2 inch or whatever seam allowance you want all the way around. And as you go, open each seam and just sew all the way around the quilt and backstitch where you started. This is stay stitching because you also fray the edges of the quilt, so that this makes a boundary of where you're fraying so that it doesn't fray too far. Alright, have fun! Here is Ranger laying on the finished rag quilt. At this point you can also toss it into the washer and dryer to make it fray even more so that there is less division and less structure to it. If you like this video, I hope you like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you very much. Ranger!